That was Maulana Abdurrahman Abrams, Alhamdulillah. Shukran, Ya Maulana. Jamaatul Muslimin, respected listeners, gives me great joy and excitement to introduce our following speaker, our guest speaker, the son of Imam Al-Shaheed Abdullah Harun, Dr. Professor Muhammad Harun, as Mullah Abdul Khalik Ali mentioned, who resides in Botswana and is one of the senior lecturers at the university in Botswana. Alhamdulillah. To please come forward, a man who has availed some time for us out of his busy schedule, and to please address the Jama'ah, min fadlik, jazakumullah khair, falyatafaddal mashkura, Professor Muhammad Harun.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa hlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. First of all, we are indeed honored to be here, Maulana Abdul Khalik and all the other shuyukh, and we thank you for giving us this opportunity. Firstly, I think we need to remind ourselves again, as we did in the Khatam and in the Ad'iyah that we did afterwards, that whenever we reflect upon the past, one of the names that cropped up daily by minute every time we think about is the example of the Prophet ﷺ. And of course we always give the salawat on the Prophet ﷺ because he is our exemplary model. Of course, as individuals, me and you and us all, we fall short of that model, but we try to strive towards following that particular model in whichever way we can. Now, why I mention this is partly to do with the fact that annually, in a sense, we normally celebrate Mawlud, or the birth of the Prophet ﷺ, partly because he had demonstrated an exemplary model that cannot in any way be overlooked by any of us. Past generations, current generation, the future generation will have to always use that. And so, mentioning our model, Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, as the model for us all and for all times, transgenerationally, transhistorically, we also think back of our own local models whom we refer to and have mentioned. Of course, we are here partly to, in a sense, commemorate, to use the one C, to celebrate another C, and to connect yet another C with these important individuals who contributed towards our community. In other words, in their own individual way, but also to show leadership in the community during a period in which our community encountered a great deal of difficulty in terms of the racist system that we were in terms of the inhumane system that we were in terms of the policies that were sort of promulgated and implemented. We, as the Maulanas Abdul Rahman just indicated, that when areas such as Stellenbosch, of course, came all under the Group Areas Act, many of our family members and families who lived nearby or in the vicinity of the masjid all had to be uprooted and had to be pushed away. And this in itself was a traumatic experience. And because of the trauma, sometimes these have not been recorded, but they should be. We remember people who basically spoke out against the apartheid system because of the trauma that it had caused, but also because of the way these developments had been seen through their eyes, based upon their understanding, and specifically the understanding of themselves as Muslims. In other words, when we look at Islam as a way of life for us all, Islam basically expects us to act in a Muslim way. We must be conscious of our duties towards Allah. In other words, there should be a vertical connection as well as a horizontal connection. Vertically, we connect with Almighty Allah, seeking our sustenance and our guidance and support from the Almighty. Like our former shuyukh who were here, I think of, as was mentioned by the Maulana, Imam Nawawi, Imam Ahmad, Imam Samai, all of the individuals in their own way contributed to what you have here today. But also outsiders, if I may put it that way, those who came from far lying, of course these days the issue of distance no more, but those who were in Cape Town connected with those who were in the Bulan. Of course at that time it was very far to travel, but these days we can travel from there to here within half an hour, partly because of the road networks and so forth. But leaving that aside, the point which I want to make is there's always been that connection. If there was a problem, it was pain felt in the Strand, then people from the Cape would respond to the pain that is there as a way of support. And so, of course, when we think back, in a sense, when we try to commemorate the past, as Maulana Abdul Khalik indicated in the Muslim news at the time, it was reported to what extent the shuyukh at the time, those who were very much concerned with these developments, came to support one another. And one of the most important identity markers, as we all know, is the masjid. In fact, when we think back of Tuan Guru, some of you might have read Shafiq Morton's text on Tuan Guru, and of course, prior to that, Dr. Ahmad Davids, who basically had written on the Bukab, and of course, wrote quite a bit also about Tuan Guru. To what extent Tuan Guru contributed to our identity? Of course, when we think of Tuan Guru, by the way, we think of the earlier shuyukh, such as Sheikh Yusuf Al-Makassari. All of these individuals contributed to who we are today. So in a sense, when we think of Imam Al-Shahid, Imam Abdullah Harun, we also think about these forebears. Because we would not have been here celebrating or commemorating or connecting if it had not been for them. So in a sense, we reconnect in our little ways through the khatams, through the khadats and so forth. Because when we think about these events, by the way, just as another footnote, when we perform khadat, why do we perform these? Of course, on one hand, as we said, to connect with Almighty. But the other is to be together, communally, to remind ourselves what the Quran has to say, what the Prophet ﷺ had said. And in that way, we connect to reinforce what? To reinforce our identity as Muslims. So wherever we go, we reflect our Muslimness, whether it's in the cafe. And by the way, my father, if I can sort of speak more personally, whenever we used to come to Stellenbosch quite often during the time when he was a representative for Wilson Roundtree, the sweet manufacturing company. And so he used to come to the outlying areas, and I used to come with him to Stellenbosch. And some of you might know there was Butamani Baba. He used to have the shop sort of just not far from here. And we used to come to him because Butamani used to originate from the 2nd Avenue in Harvey roadside. And he moved this way, as far as I recall. I mean, you might correct me. The point which I want to make is that there was always that affinity between these communities and these families as such. So in that way we were sort of, and of course we used to come to this place, come to the masjid, and in that way sort of be connected. But another issue that I just want to mention as I was listening to the recitation of the Quran by the young Hufaz, the Imam himself was Hafiz. So not, of course, not fully Hafiz, not complete, but whenever he used to take us on a trip to deliver sweets or whatever, or take orders, he used to recite the Quran. Never did he go anywhere without reciting. So you sit as a youngster in the car, and you hear him reciting. So in other words, the word of the Almighty was always constantly with him, so to speak, of course, and with us as we tune in, so to speak. But what we need to then understand is that for him, the Quran was to be imbibed, to be internalized, to basically transform. And that is how he had demonstrated his own little way. In other words, using Quran as inspiring him, and of course, wherever he went, and I was listening to our elder, Butarauda, Early on, he was narrating another event, which I said, please write down some of these. And of course, as you know, he himself is a historian, and he's been really teaching us so many little lessons of the past. And I want to basically say this, that we, hopefully our young Hufaz and others, as we grow up, should become more and more interested in writing up the history of our community. So we look forward at one point or another that somebody from Stellenbosch, not from Cape Town, not from Simonstown, from Stellenbosch, should write about the history of Stellenbosch Muslim community. And the reason for that is not to say that you are perfect, we are no perfect communities, but it is the inside story. Somebody else can come from us, like myself, can come from outside and write the story of the Boeland, about Muslims here, but I do not have the insights that you have. And so the individual from within the town must write about it and put it on the map, like Mr. Roda did with the Strand Muslim community. All of us can now read his texts, his writings about that. When we think about the Bukab, Ahmad David wrote about the Bukab. So we all have these stories, but there's a need to basically write our own little stories. So hopefully, inshallah, even some of the Maulanas who have time in between to piece together oral history, we have many of the elders who are still around, interview them, gather all that information together and write. And the reason for that is two, three, four. One is to first record the past of what had happened, because through their voices, through their ideas, we'll know what had happened. Two is partly to teach the current generation about what had happened in the past. And three is for the future generation to benefit from these stories. So these might be stories, but they are informative ones. They give advice, they give ideas. So when we think about the story of Imam Harun, a story of Sheikh Nazim, and unfortunately, as I had told Maulana Abdul Khalik some time back, we haven't written a story about Sheikh Nazim as yet. Somebody needs to do so. And many of our other shuyukh needs to be recorded. And so let me just quickly gather thoughts about Imam Abdullah Harun then. So we have been busy writing about his story, writing about who he was, and of course many of us might know how he was killed. He was killed whilst in detention. Why? Because he stood up as a Muslim against the system at the time. But more importantly, why we need to write about him is how he lived his life. How he was as a father, how he was as a husband, how he was as a community leader, how he was as a family man, how he was as an imam. And so as we probe and find and dig into the past, we come to realize the type of person he was. So as a son, we appreciate the type of ideas he had, the way he had related and connected to the community. And that is why we commemorate his memories. But we try to commemorate with the idea that we learn from these. Because after all, he was an imperfect being too. I mean, again, to touch on Buta Rauda, he was at one meeting, and the imam was criticizing using sort of a bit harsh words in the meeting. So he was just reminded, Imam, yeah, we are basically, accept the fact that we are anti-apartheid, in our ideas, but let's sort of leave some of those other words out. So in a sense, it is through anger that we basically express ourselves. So the Imam himself was, of course, imperfect, but the point which I want to make is that he had, in other ways, showed the way. And many of us have benefited from his model, and we still do. So whilst we remember the way he was killed, more importantly, we must remember the way he had lived his life. That is why we started off by saying when we think about the Prophet ﷺ, the way the Prophet had carried the Prophet self as a living model, and we, 1400 years hence, continue to draw inspiration from that model. So locally, we draw from our local models. Earlier shuyukh who have passed on, we think, for example, of Sheikh Ismail Hanif Edwards. What a wonderful individual. What an inspirational individual. What an important person theologically who has written so many manuscripts. some of which are being studied at the moment. The point which I want to make is that we have had so many luminaries that we seem to forget some of them, and we need to commemorate them. We need to celebrate their contribution. We should celebrate their inputs they have made, because through their inputs, we are where we are. Many of our shuyukh can basically say, when we think about Sheikh Bihadin, Ahmad Bihadin, when we think about Sheikh Hanif, Sheikh Abdullah Hamildin, they were important contributors to our identity. And so when we come and look at later figures such as Imam Abdul Harun, or Sheikh Nazim Muhammad, or Sheikh Abu Bakr Najjar, or Sheikh Shakir Hamildin, we know that there were theological differences among them. It's natural, not unnatural. But the point is, all of them, in one way or another, contributed to where we are, to who we are. And so, in a sense, when we celebrate individuals, we also celebrate the community. So in other words, these individuals are not individuals, it's only through their contribution and participation in the community that makes the community which it is. In other words, the way it is at the moment. We can sit here today as a result of their contribution. If they had not participated in the way they did, one sometimes wonders, where would we have been? Still running Kalfoot around in Southern Bosch? Possibly. But that has all changed. And so in a sense, we derive our inspiration from these individuals. And so, to in a sense round off my presentation, is that we encourage our youth to basically consider, continue to study, to do research, and to start writing. Writing about our communities, about our families. Because we must share these stories with whom? With the larger community, most of whom are non-Muslims. Because you and I know sometimes, non-Muslims talk about, as you know, we have been demonized in the media across the globe. We are terrorists, we are extremists, we are fundamentalists. And sometimes you and I, when we read the newspaper and say, but who is the terrorist? Who is this extremist that they talk about? Is it me? I'm reading this, but I don't see any extremism in my habits, in my behavior. Because after all, as a Muslim, we should tolerate one another. We should respect each other. We should demonstrate it. Even if again, we go back to the life of the Prophet ﷺ, how did he treat his own enemies? And we don't have to go further. We go back to our source. And you use that as a guide for us all the time. And even with his enemies, he was so tolerant. Imagine those who really pelted him with stones. Yet he accepted them. You and me, who live in a totally different period, what do we sometimes do? Do we go and kill others? You know, what happened in Sri Lanka? If those are Muslims, because again, we're living in the times of what we call conspiracies or conspiracy theorists. And I'm from those who believe that these events sometimes are not willy-nilly happen. There are other perpetrators, like we were told, people behind ISIS. There were these Zionists. I don't like to use the word Jews. I make a distinction. That these Zionists who normally prop up us to be in conflict. And we have to be wary of how they use us against one another. So let us not fall into that trap of becoming their fodder, but be above them, 5 steps, 10 steps ahead of them, through our social cohesion, by supporting one another. Yes, we have faults, as we had said earlier on. The Imam Harun had faults. Sheikh Nazim had faults. As a matter of interest, towards the end of their lives, they were not sometimes on speaking terms because of their disagreements. But there are still, when we, just as a matter of interest about Sheikh Nazim, I mean, one of the things when after my father was killed, he always came to look out, check on my mother, Khalima. Lima, is alles all right? In other words, he had that interest to care for his friend's wife and family. So in that sense, there was this concern for the other. And that is what we should be doing all the time. Be concerned with others' welfare. We know we live in an age of consumerism, where we want to consume and become wealthy and drive a lovely car and have a triple story. Fine, you may have all of that, but be not unforgetful of others. And I think this is what the Imam had demonstrated to us. Always be concerned with others. He might have lived in a double story, but he was concerned of those individuals, those communities who live in Bonteheuvel, Manenberg, and he would go out there and go into the house 12 o'clock at night in order to assist in whichever way he can. And just to finally wrap up is that, as we had mentioned in between, that he was a person who recited the Quran wherever he used to go. But also, he used to go to the karamats, to Sheikh Yusuf and these other karamats, not to go and worship there, but to basically, because he was a spiritual man in his own way. And he connected with these spiritual luminaries that were buried there, or in this qubur, as a way of connecting spiritually. So as we say that, I know in some theological groups who would say, "Jy moet nie gat na die karamats nie. This bid'ah." It's fine, it's nice to say so, but we don't see the bigger picture. We lose the bigger picture. Because we, and as we said, we're going to wrap up, we need to emphasize the notion of Tawheed, the concept of Allah, how to understand our Lord, how to understand our Creator, how to basically draw inspiration from the Quran, where we recite and which we recite on a daily basis. And in that way, we will be mindful. So whatever activities we do, like what the Imam did, he reminded himself that whatever he did, he has to connect sort of vertically. And of course, in order to be connected horizontally. So with these few words, I know I've not been sort of coherently structured, but as a way of just inspiring us and advising myself that we need to be mindful of our duties towards our fellow human beings as we are towards the Almighty. وآخر دعوان والحمد لله رب العالمين. I just wish to apologize that I've got to leave I must catch a flight. So my apologies for not being able to stay around near Maulana and Shuyukh. And so with this, please forgive us for our shortcomings. وآخر دعوان والحمد لله رب العالمين.